Morning in this town always started the same way, with the shrill cry of a rooster overpowering the silence, as if to remind everyone that life here was governed by unspoken rules. The fog drifted low over the cracked sidewalks, and there was a heaviness in the air that was impossible not to feel. The city lived by its own laws. Some were born on top, others in the shadows. For the James family, it was a perpetual shadow. The Jameses' house stood on the outskirts, almost at the end of the street, where the asphalt turned to earth and the town seemed to forget about its inhabitants. Sean, their 12-year-old son, often sat on the porch with a book in his hands. Despite his wheelchair, he never allowed himself to complain. Books were his refuge, his way of escaping from a world that looked at him with contempt. Every sheet of paper, every line of text became for him a window to another, kinder world. Police officer Carl Grayson was particularly angry that morning. It had been a restless night. Rowdy teenagers, petty thefts, on-duty taunts from fellow officers. Carl considered himself the master of this town. He was the one who kept order in a world that he felt was getting dirtier and dirtier because of people like the James family. Every look Sean gave him from the window of the house, every book he read, seemed like a challenge to Carl. "That puppy's out on the street with his papers again," Carl muttered as he slowly parked his patrol car on the corner. In his eyes, the boy was no more than a nuisance. In every glance, he saw an accusation, every smile a mockery. At that moment, the door of the James house creaked open. Sean's mother, Sarah, appeared on the porch. Her gaze was as steadfast as her son's. In that look, Carl saw what he hated most. She wasn't afraid of him. "Mornin'," Sarah tossed over her shoulder, though her voice sounded cold. Carl didn't answer, only grinned. Tension hung in the air. He knew he could do anything he wanted to this family. Here, in this town, the police uniform was a symbol of authority, not law. Sean, meanwhile, closed the book as if sensing something wrong. His fingers nervously gripped the pages, but he tried not to show fear. He already knew this day would be different. Too long had Carl looked at their house. Too often his car had stopped here. Too cold was the man's gaze. Maybe Sean was wrong. Or maybe this day would really be the beginning of something terrible. Sean rolled his wheelchair along the sidewalk, moving slowly to a small park not far from his house. It was his ritual. A few minutes in the fresh air with a book to take his mind off the harsh reality. A light breeze blew through the pages of an old volume of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and sunlight streamed through the dense tree crowns. Sean loved this place. He felt safe here. But today, safety was an illusion. The thud of heavy boots and the metallic clank of a belt buckle came from behind him. Sean didn't turn around right away, but he felt the tension, as if an invisible shadow had come over him. Carl Grayson stood a few feet away, leaning against a tree, his gaze heavy and judgmental. "What have you got there?" Carl growled, crossing his arms over his chest. Sean looked up, meeting the cold expression on the policeman's face. He didn't want to answer, but he couldn't stay silent. "A book," he replied briefly, showing the cover. Carl grinned, leaning closer. "A book? You think sitting here like a white boy reading your white books is going to make you a better person?" There was contempt in his voice. "Who are you, anyway, to think it's going to make you better? You can't even walk, and books aren't going to help you get out of the mud." Sean clenched his fists, holding the book in his lap. His heart beat faster, but he didn't want to show how much those words hurt him. "Books teach you not to be like you," he said quietly but firmly. Carl froze for a second, his face twisted with anger. Those words, spoken by a child, hurt his ego. He snatched the book out of Sean's hands like it was a dirty rag. "Not being like me? You don't even realize who I am." He threw the book to the ground and stepped on it with a heavy boot. "You're nothing. You're just a little nigger who thinks he's smarter than everybody else in his wheelchair." Sean felt his eyes fill with tears, but he held back. He saw the hatred in Carl's eyes, real and unbridled, but also something else. Fear. Carl was afraid that Sean wouldn't give up, that he would prove stronger than anyone expected. "Give the book back," the boy muttered, despite the tremor in his voice. Carl only laughed as he picked up the book from the ground. He held it like a toy and tore the first page. The paper cracked like a string with a sound. Sean felt a wave of anger rising inside him, but he was powerless. "Maybe I'll do you a favor and burn this stuff so you don't waste your time," Carl said, tossing the torn pages to the ground. "Read the papers. At least they tell the truth." At that moment, Sarah, Sean's mother, who had seen what was happening from a distance, approached them. Her face was hard, but her eyes burned with anger. "What do you think you're doing, officer?" Her voice was loud, and there was no fear in it. "This is my son, and you have no right to humiliate him." Carl straightened up, lifting his chin as if he wanted to show his superiority. "I'm doing my job, Mrs. James, teaching your boy about real life, 'cause you don't seem to have taught him that." Sarah took a step forward, stepping between Carl and her son. "You think your uniform protects you from liability? Believe me, you have no idea who you're dealing with." Carl didn't answer. He turned and walked away, throwing the book to the ground as if it were a useless rag. But something cracked inside him. This wasn't the last time their paths would cross, and he already knew what he would do next time. Sean watched his mother pick up the torn book, her hands shaking with anger. He sensed that this was only the beginning of something dark, something that would change their lives forever. Sean sat in his wheelchair in the schoolyard, watching children his age running around the playground, laughing and shouting. His book lay in his lap, and, as always, he was immersed in reading, trying to shut himself off from a world that was rarely kind to him. It was an old book, battered by time, but every corner of it was dear to him as a reminder of a better future, a world where no one would judge him. Carl Grayson watched him from the other side of the road, sitting in his patrol car. His mind was seething with anger, but now it was mixed with a compulsive need to prove his power, to assert authority. This boy had no right to look him in the eye the way he had last time, and certainly no right to cross him. He was determined that it would not go unpunished. The day was coming to an end, and the schoolyard was beginning to empty. Sean, noticing that the time was almost up, closed his book, preparing to go home. At that moment, Carl abruptly turned the car around and stopped right in front of him, getting out of the car with a stony expression on his face. "Are you sitting here again, playing smart-ass?" Carl roughly snatched the book out of his hands, not even bothering to look at the title. "What is it this time? Stories about good people who don't mean anything?" Sean instinctively clutched the wheels of the wheelchair, as if that would give him some control over the situation. He wanted to say something, but he couldn't. Carl ripped the cover off the book and tossed it aside as if it were just a piece of trash. "Give it back!" Sean shouted, his voice shaking with rage and despair. "That's mine." These words acted on Carl like gasoline on fire. He grabbed the book by the remaining pages and walked over to the nearest trash can where wrappers and bottles were lying around. Taking a lighter from his pocket, he smiled, looking directly into the boy's eyes. "This is how your dreams end," he hissed, setting the corner of the book on fire. The flames quickly spread to the pages, and Sean watched his only refuge in this world burn to the ground. He wanted to scream, to stop it, but he was powerless. Several children had gathered nearby and were watching with interest. Some of them started laughing. "Look," shouted one of the boys, "the policeman is teaching him how to live. Maybe his wheelchair will be next." That laughter was worse than fire itself. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he didn't make a sound, clutching the armrest so tightly that his fingers turned white. He didn't want Carl to see how much it hurt him, but it was impossible to hide the pain. Carl, satisfied with his cruelty, tossed the charred remains of the book into the trash can and stepped closer to Sean, leaning in to be level with his face. "Now, do you realize where you belong?" he whispered, his voice low but menacing. "People like you must remember that you will never be equal." Sean didn't answer anything. His heart was beating so hard that he almost didn't hear Carl's words. All he could see was the smoke rising into the sky, taking with it everything that was important to him. It wasn't just a fire, it was the destruction of his dream, his hope. When Carl finally left, leaving behind smoldering ashes, Sean remained seated. The children who had been laughing earlier began to disperse, leaving him alone. But he knew one thing. This wasn't the end. Something inside him began to change. Anger, despair, and pain mixed into one emotion that pushed him forward. He couldn't fight Carl now, but he promised himself that this day wouldn't be just a memory. It would be the beginning of something more. It was a particularly quiet evening. There was a strange, oppressive silence in the air, as if the town were holding its breath before a storm. Sean sat by the window, watching his faithful dog Ranger scurry around the yard, happily snatching up a toy Sarah had thrown him. To Sean, Ranger was more than a dog. He was his friend, his protector, the only one who never looked at him with pity. Where others saw a boy in a wheelchair, Ranger saw just Sean. Meanwhile, Carl Grayson was finishing his nightly rounds. His anger at the recent incident had not subsided, but had only grown. The image of the boy, unbroken even after the burning of his books, was eating Carl up inside. That look, a look full of reproach and strength, haunted him, and he decided this boy must be broken completely. Late at night, when the lights in the James house were out, Carl drove up to their house. Turning on his headlights, he stepped out of the car silently, baton in hand. His gaze fell on Ranger, who immediately perked up his ears and growled, sensing danger. But that only made Carl angrier. "Well, dog, do you want to contradict me too?" he muttered, approaching the animal. Ranger lunged forward, defending his territory, but Carl was ready. He struck the dog sharply with the club, the sound of the blow echoing through the quiet courtyard, making Ranger whimper. Sean woke up to the sound. His heart clenched in his chest as he realized something was wrong. He reached for the wheelchair to get to the door faster, but his movements were slow, helpless at this point. Outside, Carl continued his brutal actions. He beat Ranger again and again until the animal stopped resisting. When Sean finally opened the door, his gaze froze on what he saw. Ranger lay motionless, his fur smeared with dirt and blood, and Carl stood over him, holding his club as if it were a trophy. "Do you want to understand what real loss is?" Carl said coldly, looking at the boy. "This is what reality is. This is a world where people like you mean nothing. Sean couldn't get a word out. His breath hitched, and his fingers clenched the armrests of the wheelchair so hard his knuckles turned white. Tears sprang from his eyes, but he still looked straight at Carl, even though he was afraid and in pain. That look spoke of the hatred that now lived inside him. Carl leaned over the ranger's body, took a few steps toward Sean, and grinned. "Forget about your dog," he said, dropping the club next to the animal's body. "You better think about what will happen to your family if you keep defying me." Sean didn't answer. He was paralyzed, but not because of his disability. It was the pain of loss, the anger and despair that blended into one inexpressible flood of emotions. Carl left, got into his car, and drove away, leaving a trail of dirt and fear behind him. Sean sat in the yard until dawn, next to Ranger's body, not knowing what to say to his mother, how to explain what had happened. This wasn't just the loss of a friend. It was a murder of hope, an attempt to break everything that kept his family afloat. But something inside Sean had changed. Where there had been pain before, determination now lived. Carl Grayson had taken too much from him, and Sean swore this would be the last time either of them would lose. The James house was plunged into silence. The early morning seemed heavier than the night when Sarah found Sean sitting in the yard next to Ranger's lifeless body. She hadn't asked a single question. Instead, she simply knelt down, wrapping her arms around the dead dog. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't utter a sound. She and Sean exchanged glances, and there were more words in that silence than they could have spoken. Grief, anger, a sense of injustice, all of it had become common to them. Sean didn't move away from the wheelchair. His fingers were still clutching the armrests. Carl's words, cold and hateful, were in his head. Again and again he heard the sound of the baton striking, saw the Ranger fall. It seemed to him that this memory would crowd out everything else, as if now he had no past, no future, only this moment. Sarah took the dog's body behind the house to bury it. Sean watched her movements, feeling a heaviness in his soul that couldn't be put into words. They knew what had happened, and they knew who was to blame. But what could they do? Go to the police? Carl was part of that very department. He wore a uniform that gave him the right to do anything, to go unpunished. The city had always been like that. If you were born with a different skin color, you were an outsider. If you dared to be different, the weaker one, like Sean in his wheelchair, you were even more vulnerable. In this town, the law was only for those who could dictate it. Sarah still decided to fight, even though she knew it was like fighting the wind. She went to the police station that afternoon, holding the picture of Ranger in her hands. Her face was hard, but a deep weariness was red in her eyes. Behind the counter sat an officer who didn't even bother to look up when she approached. "I need to apply," she said, her voice sounding confident, though everything inside was trembling. The officer looked up lazily. It was Ed, one of Carl's senior colleagues. He knew why Sarah had come, and there was no sympathy or interest in his eyes. "What's this about?" he asked, pushing aside a stack of papers. "Carl Grayson killed my son, killed his dog." She hesitated, searching for words. "I want him to answer for it." Ed raised his eyebrows, but he wasn't surprised. His lips curved into a slight grin, as if she'd told him something funny. "Do you want to report our officer?" he asked me again. "Sarah, look, maybe you're imagining things. You know how it is. Kids make things up." Sarah felt the rage boiling in her chest. She leaned closer, placing the Ranger's picture on the counter. "This isn't fiction. it's murder." Her voice got harder. "And if you do nothing, this murder will be on your conscience." Ed hummed quietly and tucked the picture away. "You want to know what I think, Sarah? I think you should be thankful Carl didn't hurt your boy. He's got discipline problems, you know that." Sarah didn't answer anything. She realized that this conversation was going nowhere. She turned and walked away, leaving the picture on the counter. She knew the police wouldn't do anything, but she couldn't just sit at home. She had to at least try. Meanwhile, at school, Sean faced a new wave of humiliation. Rumors of what had happened to the ranger spread quickly. The peers to whom Carl had once been a hero took it as further proof of his strength. At recess, they whispered while looking at Sean, and some even mocked right to his face. "What? Your dog won't protect you anymore?" said one of the older boys, approaching him in the hallway. "He must have realized you were worthless." Sean turned away, trying to ignore the words, but that only encouraged the crowd. One of them came closer, leaned over, and poked his finger into the back of his wheelchair. "Maybe it's time for you to disappear like your dog. Then all your problems would be solved at once." The words pierced him, but he remained silent. He couldn't show his weakness, couldn't give them what they wanted. Sean held on, but inside everything was burning. This anger, this despair was growing every day, turning into something he couldn't control. In the evening, when Sarah got home, she found Sean sitting by the window. He wasn't eating, he wasn't talking, just staring at one point, clutching Ranger's old leash in his hands. She knew he was experiencing this loss in his own way, that his silence was his way of coping. She wanted to comfort him, but she didn't know how. The city around them lived its life as if nothing had happened. People walked the streets, smiling at each other, but every one of them knew that the James family was different. No one offered help, no one supported them. Sarah and Sean were alone in this world full of hate and injustice, but there was power in that silence. Sean knew he couldn't stay silent forever. This anger, this pain, had to find a way out. He didn't know what that outlet would be, but he sensed the moment was coming. And when it came, Carl Grayson would realize that not everyone could be broken. Carl Grayson was finishing his shift when the familiar voice of the dispatcher sounded on his radio station. Muffled and mechanical, it relayed the message that there would be a department management meeting that evening. Carl snorted, tossing the radio on the seat. The meetings never boded well for anything interesting. They were always a formality, where the police captain handed out instructions and then disappeared behind a closed door where the real business was decided. Carl knew he was just a pawn in this system, but that suited him. Here he could make his own rules, go unpunished. Upon entering the station building, Carl immediately sensed something wrong. The atmosphere was tense, as if the air in the room had become heavier. His colleagues were sitting at their desks, talking in hushed tones, but when he entered, they stopped talking. Carl felt their glances. They weren't friendly, but that didn't surprise him. He was used to envy and judgment. To him, it was a sign of strength. "Grayson to the captain," one of the officers said, pointing toward an office at the far end of the corridor. Carl frowned. His summons to the captain's office had been unexpected. Usually, meetings with his superiors avoided him, unless they involved awards or minor reprimands. But he rose, trying to remain confident. His footsteps echoed through the long corridor, and each step felt heavier and heavier. When Carl entered the office, he immediately noticed the man sitting behind the massive wooden desk. It was Captain James. Tall, with a military posture, he radiated strength and calmness. His name was known to everyone in town, a man with an ironclad reputation, able to silence others with a single glance. Carl didn't often cross paths with the captain, but he always respected him for his ability to keep order. The captain looked up, and Carl immediately felt a cold stab of fear. His gaze was heavy, filled with what could not be called mere anger. "Sit down, Grayson." The captain's voice was low, commanding. Carl obeyed, trying to hide his anxiety. He tried to understand what the conversation would be about, but what happened next threw him completely off balance. "How long have you been working here?" the captain began, leaning back in his chair. 10 years, sir," Carl replied, trying to speak calmly. The captain nodded, crossed his fingers, and looked directly at Carl. "In those 10 years, you've probably gotten to feel like you own the city. But sometimes I think people like you forget who really holds this city in their hands." Carl tensed. His palms were sweating, but he didn't let himself move. "It has come to my attention that you have taken an interest in a certain family," the captain continued, his voice growing colder and colder. "A family that, as it turned out, was directly related to me." Carl frowned. "Family?" The captain kept talking, and each word was like a hammer blow. "The boy you humiliated, the dog you killed. This family is my family, Grayson." Carl froze. His breathing stopped, and in that moment his world came crashing down. The boy's father was not just anyone, but a police captain. A man feared and respected even by those above him. This was more than a mistake. It was a disaster. "Sir, I didn't know." Carl started to justify himself, but his voice shook. The captain stood up abruptly, his massive figure eclipsing the light from the desk lamp. "You didn't know? Would it have made a difference if I had? Do you think that justifies your brutality, your racism? You think the uniform makes you untouchable?" His voice was loud, but not shouting. It was dangerously calm. Carl did not know what to answer. He saw the rage in the captain's eyes that threatened to consume him. He realized that this was not just a matter of personal revenge. It was a matter of principle, a matter of honor. "Did you think it would go unnoticed? Did you think I would let you get away with it?" The captain continued, stepping closer to Carl. "I'm not just your superior. I'm a father, and you've gone too far." Carl felt the cold sweat running down his back. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. This conversation was the beginning of the end. Carl understood that, but he also realized that the captain wouldn't end it there. "Go away, Grayson," the captain said, his voice low again, almost a whisper. "I'll decide what to do with you. But remember one thing. Your actions will have consequences." Carl walked out of the office, feeling his legs become absorbent cotton. His world was really falling apart. He realized that he had stumbled into something bigger than he had ever imagined. But instead of remorse, a new feeling began to boil up inside him. Despair mixed with hatred. He knew his career, his status, everything was in jeopardy. But he also knew he wouldn't give up without a fight. Captain James drove home along the winding road that led to the outskirts of town. Anger was simmering inside him, and he kept it carefully contained. He had always considered himself a man capable of controlling his emotions, but today that line seemed too thin. The streets, which usually seemed calm to him, now looked grim, as if reflecting his own state of mind. The picture of what Carl Grayson had done to his son and their dog couldn't get out of his head. It wasn't just cruelty, it was war declared on his family, and James wasn't one to leave such things unanswered. When he pulled up to his house, dusk had already begun to envelop the streets. Sarah met him on the doorstep, her eyes red with tears. She didn't say a word, just pointed toward the living room where Sean sat. The boy was motionless in his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on one point. James froze for a moment, realizing the full extent of the devastation this day had brought to his family. Then he walked over to Sean, placing his hand gently on his shoulder. "I know what happened, son," he said quietly, "and I promise it won't go unpunished." Sean didn't answer, but his eyes met his father's for a moment. There was an anger in them, an anger as deep and overwhelming as the one burning in James's heart. He realized he couldn't delay any longer. James walked out of the house and got into the car. He knew where he needed to go. Carl lived nearby, in a small house with well-trimmed bushes and a flag on the porch. The man always liked to show his loyalty to the law, making himself look patriotic and protective. But James saw right through him. He knew that Carl Grayson was just a coward hiding his hatred behind his police uniform. When he pulled up in front of Carl's house, the evening light was still burning in the windows. James got out of the car, his steps slow but firm. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door, which to his surprise was unlocked. Carl was sitting on the couch, a bottle of beer in his hands, his face contorted in a contemptuous grin when he saw the captain. "Oh, Captain, have you decided to pay me a personal visit?" Carl set the bottle on the table, his voice drenched in sarcasm. "Frankly, I wasn't expecting it." James didn't sit down, didn't answer. He just stood there, his figure towering over Carl, and the silence grew more and more oppressive. "You crossed the line, Grayson," James finally said, his voice quiet but threatening. "Did you think you could do whatever you wanted to my family and there would be no repercussions?" Carl grinned, leaning back on the back of the couch. "With your family?" He stretched out, pretending to be surprised. "It was just a coincidence. Your boy's a real fighter, by the way. I even liked the way he tried to look brave. And his dog? Well, I had to show him who's boss." James took a step forward, and Carl's expression changed. The grin was gone, giving way to wariness. "Listen to me, Grayson," James said, looking straight into the cop's eyes. "You touched my son. You destroyed what little he loved. Did you think it would go unnoticed? Did you think your uniform would protect you?" Carl took the beer and took a sip, trying to remain indifferent, but his hands trembled slightly. He knew what Captain James was capable of. His reputation wasn't just a rumor. The man was known for his toughness, and now Carl felt like he was in a trap that wouldn't be easy to get out of. "Do you really think you can intimidate me?" Carl said, trying to sound confident. "I'm acting within the law. No one can prove that I did anything wrong. Your family? They're just pathetic people who mess with the order of this town." James slammed his fist sharply on the table, and Carl flinched. His mask of indifference cracked, and a shadow of fear appeared on his face. "You don't realize the shit you're in," James said quietly. "You think the law is on your side? You think your coworkers have your back? I'm going to make you regret every single thing you've done. You'll lose everything. Your job, your respect, the life you built on hate and fear." Carl was silent for the first time in the entire conversation. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back. James kept talking, his voice icy. "You want to know what it's like to be defenseless? I'll show you. From now on, you will feel the way my son felt when you destroyed his dreams and his friend." Carl tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He realized that this conversation wasn't just a warning. It was a threat, real and imminent. James turned and walked out, leaving the door open. Carl sat on the couch, feeling his confidence crumble to pieces. He knew the captain wasn't kidding, and now he realized that he had started a war he had no chance of winning. The city, always hiding its secret prejudices under a mask of calm, began to splinter like a cracked mirror. Rumors of the conflict between Captain James and Carl Grayson spread to every corner. Every house, every cafe, every shop was filled with whispers, gossip, and gossip. The inhabitants, many of whom for years had lived with a distaste for others because of their color, sex, or social status, were now divided into two camps. To one part of the city, Captain James remained a symbol of strength and justice. His reputation as a man who never tolerated disorder made him respected even by those who feared his authority. But even among his supporters, there were those who grudgingly whispered that he was too protective of his own, and that this James family allows itself too much. The other part of the town that supported Carl Grayson saw him as a victim. For them, Carl was the one who kept order in the city, a real man who was not afraid to put the insolent in their place. They justified his actions, writing off the need for tough actions to keep the peace. None of these people wanted to talk about the Ranger or the burned books, preferring to accuse Sean and his family of provocation. At this time, the James family felt the walls of the city begin to shrink around them. Sarah could no longer go to the store without facing scornful looks and whispers behind her back. One time, while buying bread, she heard someone in line tossed in her direction. "Maybe it was your boy's fault. You should have minded your own business." Sarah turned, struggling to hold back tears, but said nothing. She knew that any word would only inflame the conflict. There was no place in this town for people like them, and now it was more obvious than ever. Sean, despite his wheelchair, continued to go to school. He felt he had to show Carl and everyone else that he would not be broken. But every day became a challenge. His classmates, who used to simply avoid him, now openly laughed and taunted him. In one of his classes, someone placed a note on his desk. It said in big letters, "One day your wheelchair will burn down too. How's that, smartass?" Sean clutched the note in his hand, trying not to show how much it hurt him. But his hands were shaking, and anger spilled into his chest. He felt alone, despite his parents' support. Every day he looked into the faces of his classmates and saw the hatred and contempt they used to skillfully hide. Sarah tried to find support from her neighbors, but their doors remained closed. Those who used to nod their greetings to her now turned away. One of the neighbors, an elderly man she had known for years, came up to her on the street one day and said, "Look, Sarah, maybe you and your son should leave. This whole thing is blowing up because of you. You shouldn't be here, if you know what I mean." Those words were a knife to the heart. Sarah didn't answer, just turned and walked away. She knew that even those who had seemed neutral before were now against them. James, too, felt his position begin to falter. At a meeting at the police station, several officers hinted that his personal affairs were interfering with his work. One of them, barely concealing a smirk, said, "We all realize, Captain, that family is important, but maybe we should be careful. People in this town don't want to be protected by those who put their own interests ahead of everyone else's." James didn't answer anything, but in that moment he realized that the city was willing to betray him, despite his years of service. To them, his race, his family, all of that had always come first, and his service could never change that. One night, when the James house was shrouded in silence, there was the sound of breaking glass. Sarah rushed to the window and saw a wooden cross burning on the front lawn. She knew it wasn't just a cruel prank. It was a direct signal. They weren't welcome in this town. Sean watched the fire from the window of his room. His face remained stony, but Sarah could see his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair tightly. James stepped outside, looking at the blazing cross. He knew this wasn't just an attack on his family. This was a declaration of war. He turned around and walked back into the house without saying a word. A plan was maturing in his mind. This town had shown its face, and he was going to make sure his family never felt helpless again. Night shrouded the city in a thick, oppressive gloom. After the burning of the cross in front of the James house, Captain James could not sleep. His thoughts were filled with rage and a sense of injustice. This was his town, his family, and he wasn't going to take it anymore. It was no longer a matter of legality or rules for him. It had become personal. James sat at the kitchen table, looking at an old photograph of his family. It was of him, Sarah, and little Sean, who could still walk, before the accident that had changed everything. His gaze stopped on his son's face, and something inside him clicked. It wasn't just anger, it was determination. He would wait no longer. Justice must be done with his own hands. By morning, James knew where to start. He went to the police station, but not to ask for support or write a statement. He went inside with cold confidence, and those in the room instantly sensed his mood. They knew something had changed. "Is Grayson here?" he asked the duty officer dryly. The officer, noticing the captain's gaze, blanched. "No, sir. He took the day off." James only nodded, but something dangerous flashed in his eyes. He knew where to find Carl, so he decided not to waste any time. He headed toward Grayson's house, which looked like a small fortress with a neat lawn and an American flag on the porch. James stopped on the sidewalk, staring at this house like a predator watching its prey. Carl was sitting in his garage, unaware of the visit. He was cleaning his gun, humming an old tune to himself. James entered without bothering to knock. Carl looked up, and his face instantly paled. He knew this moment was coming, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. "Captain," he said, trying to sound confident, though his voice trembled. "To what do I owe the honor?" "We'll talk," James answered, his voice as cold as steel. "You're only going to cross the line once, Grayson, and you've already done it." Carl grinned, hiding his anxiety behind a mask of self-assurance. James stepped closer, his figure looming over Carl, and he could no longer hide the trembling in his hands. "Misunderstanding?" His voice grew quieter, but there was more threat in it than shouting. "You burned my son's books. You killed his dog. You terrorized my family, and you think you can just get away with it?" Carl stood up, trying to look brave, but James instantly grabbed him by the collar and pushed him against the wall. Carl tried to resist, but the captain was stronger. "You can keep hiding behind your uniform," James said, his face only a few inches from Carl's. "But I'm going to make you feel the pain you've caused my family." Carl knew the captain wasn't bluffing. The man was too dangerous to underestimate, but he was still trying to hold on. "You think the law is on your side?" Carl hissed, trying to get free. "This town belongs to people like me." James let him go, but only to take a step back and watch Carl try to regain his dignity. "You're right. The law isn't on my side," James said quietly, "but I don't play by those rules anymore." Carl didn't realize what that meant until he heard the sound of breaking glass. When he turned around, he saw his car, parked outside the garage, starting to go up in flames. The flames quickly engulfed the car, and Carl rushed toward the exit, yelling something about the fire department. But James stayed where he was, watching the chaos he had caused. That was just the first step. Over the next few days, James began compiling a dossier on Carl. All his dirty deeds, bribes, abuse of power, it all came out. James used his connections to spread the word, and soon Carl's name became synonymous with corruption. His co-workers began to turn their backs on him, and the townspeople began to whisper behind his back. But that wasn't enough. James wanted Carl to feel the same helplessness his son felt when he sat in a wheelchair, looked at a burning cross, or listened to ridicule. He wanted Carl to live in fear. Carl came home one night and found a piece of charred wood on his doorstep that looked like the cross that had been burned in front of the James house. On it was a note. Soon you will realize what it means to be on the other side. Carl began to lose sleep. His confidence vanished, leaving room for fear. He knew the captain wouldn't stop, and the further James went, the more Carl realized that this was no longer just revenge. This was retribution, and there was no stopping it. The night was heavy, as if the sky itself had fallen lower, crushing the city with its darkness. There was a wary silence in the James house that evening. Sarah was sitting in a chair by the window, her hands nervously rubbing her handkerchief, her eyes staring outside where nothing was happening, but where danger was felt in every rustle. Sean was in his room, in his wheelchair. He was staring at an old picture of the Ranger, trying to stay afloat in an ocean of anger and pain. James was out there somewhere. His absence felt almost physically. Sarah knew her husband had gone off to war again, and this time he might not come back. The city was boiling. The rift that had begun after the conflict between James and Charles was at its peak. Carl's supporters organized a meeting in the local hall, where speeches were made about the town losing its roots, and that some people were trying to impose foreign orders. The speech was veiled, but everyone knew exactly what was meant. James, for his part, was not silent either. He used his connections to get the truth out about Charles and his supporters, but the more dirt was uncovered, the more the city descended into chaos. Carl Grayson lived like a hunted animal. His house was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a cage. Every night he checked the doors and windows, his gun under his pillow and a bottle of whiskey on the nightstand next to it. The threats, the notes, the strange calls at night, it was all driving him crazy. He knew James was closing in like a predator, but he didn't know where or when the next strike would come, and it was slowly destroying him. But that night, it had to end. James showed up at Carl's house late, almost morning. He stood in the shadows, watching the light in the windows. Carl was awake. It was obvious. His silhouette flickered behind the curtains. He moved quickly, nervously. James took his time. He knew that fear had already done half the work for him, but now it was time for the final act. He went to the door and knocked. There was a thud of footsteps, then silence. Carl opened the door slowly, gun in hand. "Have you come to kill me?" he asked, his voice shaky but still angry. "No," James answered, his voice calm, almost tired. "I'm here to finish this." Carl laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter. It was the laugh of a man who knows he has lost. "You've already ruined everything," he said. "I have nothing anymore. My reputation, my job, even my friends all gone because of you." "You have only yourself to blame," James said coldly. "You started the war. You humiliated my son, killed his friend. Did you think I was just going to watch that?" Carl raised his gun, pointing it at James. "I may have done something wrong, but you're no saint, James. You think you're better than me? You're just like me, only you have rank and power. But we both know the truth doesn't matter here." James didn't flinch. He stepped forward slowly, and Carl lowered the gun, his hand shaking. He realized he'd lost, but he couldn't accept it. "You're right," James said quietly. "We're both dirty, but the difference is that I'm willing to pay my price." "Are you? You're just hiding behind your uniform and you're afraid." Carl made a sudden movement, and the gun went off. The sound broke the silence of the night, echoing down the street. James staggered, his hand clutching his side, but he didn't fall. At that moment, he lunged forward, snatching the gun from Carl's hands and pushing him against the wall. "It's over, Grayson," he said through gritted teeth. But before he could do anything, Sarah appeared in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with horror. She saw the blood on her husband's clothes, saw Carl cornered, head down, and in that moment she realized that neither of them was the man they used to be. "Enough," she said, her voice hard. "None of us will win this war." James lowered his arms, his breathing heavy. Carl slid to the floor, huddled against the wall, his face wet with tears. That night was the end of their conflict, but there were no winners. James had paid his price, the loss of himself, of his humanity. Carl was broken, stripped of everything he had, and the city they had both tried to protect or control was left broken, steeped in its old prejudices and hatreds. Sean looked at his father when he got home, his wound bandaged, but his gaze was blank. It was the price of truth, the price everyone paid. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? We really need to hear your opinions and your stories. Each and every one of you is incredibly important to us, and we sincerely appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and put a like if this story made you think. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a good and peaceful day.